why does the heart beat? The heart beats so that it can circulate blood. And the mystery then is, well, okay, the circulation is something that happens in the future. How can the future explain the past without some kind of magical causation? If what we're talking about is how do we understand the origin of life, the emergence of life, you need to get clear on what life really is. It's not just replication that makes something alive. It's got to be the right kind of thing that's being replicated. In their view, it's self-protection and self-repair are the fundamental features of life.
There has to be organisms of the kind they're talking about before you can get an evolutionary process going. Figuring out what constitutes a living thing is a prior conceptual issue to the issue of how organisms evolve.
We have to know what emerges, but then you have to also have some thinking about what an emergent process is. Deacon's perspective is, instead of thinking about some new stuff coming into being, think of it as some kind of constraint placed on the constituent parts of the thing.
What he's saying about the self being selfish is a description of moral goodness, but I think he just resists saying that.
Yeah.
Even though descriptively he thinks that is true about selves, he doesn't want to normatively endorse that as something that's morally good.
Even the conception of selfishness, obviously we can use it in that extended sense that organisms are self-interested in that they're guided by their own well-being or flourishing, but they're not self-interested in the human sense that they have a conception of their interests that they're pursuing, because obviously humans can genuinely choose not to do that.
Welcome to ARI Bookshelf, a podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm Mike Mazza, Associate Fellow at ARI. Joining me today are Ben Bayer, also Fellow at ARI, Tristan de Liege, Postdoctoral Fellow at ARI, and for the first time on ARI Bookshelf, Jim Lennox, Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh, one of the founders of the Ayn Rand Society, affiliated with the American Philosophical Association, and one of the founding editors of the book series Ayn Rand Society Philosophical Studies. Today on ARI Bookshelf, we're discussing the book Neither Ghost Nor Machine by Jeremy Sherman. Sherman's book is a popular presentation of UC Berkeley neuroscientist and anthropologist Terrence Deacon's theory of life, agency, and purpose. So as beginning context, we're reading something that's a secondary source on another thinker's theory. So keep in mind all the usual caveats that this is one person's presentation of someone else's scientific theory. And on that note, Ben, I think we want to start with a little bit of a discussion of why we're talking about a book on a scientific theory on a podcast that usually discusses philosophical topics.
So both Sherman's secondary presentation and Deacon's primary source are kind of mixtures of scientific theorizing, hypothesizing, and philosophic speculation. But there's a real philosophical question here. And the way that at least the way that Sherman, I haven't read the Deacon book, Jim has read a lot of it, at least the way that Sherman presents it is it's about what he calls the mystery of purpose. And there's an ambiguity about exactly what he means by this. What he means by purpose is how does the notion of a purpose or a goal or any kind of teleological concept fit into our scientific discourse about the universe, in particular about living creatures. It makes perfect sense to talk about how a human being can have a purpose. You envision some goal you want to achieve consciously, you work toward it. But there at least have been puzzles among philosophers and scientists about whether it makes sense to extend that kind of language to the wider living kingdom, in particular non-conscious living organisms like plants and bacteria, which of course don't have any kind of consciousness, but which, at least by many people's accounts, appear to pursue goals, but they couldn't possibly be conscious goals. And so in what sense does it make sense to talk about that? And there is a question there that has to be answered philosophically. Now, the way that Sherman at least seems to talk about it somehow is that you won't solve that mystery. You won't show how teleological concepts can kind of fit into a naturalistic picture of the world unless you also show how the very first, most primitive uh, 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 goal-pursuing organisms could have evolved. And I think that while there's an interesting scientific question there, it's not the same as the question of can we make sense of a concept of goals that apply to non-conscious beings. I think we have to take it for granted. First of all, of course, purpose exists for human beings. There's no mystery there. That's like the paradigm case of the concept. That's where it comes from. And I also think we have to take it for granted that there's something very like conscious purpose that operates with non-conscious organisms. It's not conscious, but there's a real similarity there. And the fact that there's that similarity is what Darwin was relying on when he made his analogy between artificial selection, what he then goes on to call natural selection, in order to explain evolution. So there's a real similarity there. I think there's a concept we need to capture it, to understand and to explain biological behavior. But I also don't think that the scientific question of how did this behavior originally evolve, in fact, how did life originate? I don't think you need to answer that question in order to understand that there is this meaningful, non-conscious teleological concept. So I don't think you need to have or prove the hypothesis that Deacon goes on to elaborate on in order to solve the philosophical puzzle here. It only seems mysterious philosophically that there could be a kind of non-conscious goal pursuit in living creatures if you have a really impoverished, stripped down understanding of scientific concepts, especially causal concepts, where if you have a super materialistic version of a conception of causation that biases you against the idea that there's something important about what Aristotle called formal and final causes that make you favor everything in terms of material and efficient causation, that's what's going to make it seem mysterious that there could be this similarity between non-conscious and conscious teleology. But if you push that aside, if you embrace like the full, robust conception of all the different ways in which things can cause each other and which things can be explained, and we'll talk more about that today, then I don't think there's a mystery here. Though you do have to get clear on the answer to that philosophic question if you're going to then do the scientific investigation that I think Sherman and Deacon want to do.
Yeah, so there's the question, how can we ground concepts of purpose and norms in the naturalistic picture of the world? And there's so how do we understand Sherman and Deacon's basic answer to that question? Like, but prior to hypothesizing about the origins of light, et cetera, they have an answer to that question. And the answer is that we ground these concepts in the needs of individual selves, which is kind of Deacon's term that I think we all had a puzzle. Why is he talking about selves instead of organisms? The idea
You said selves,
yes,
cells, right?
yes,
Explains what
self.
what's puzzling about that is when people hear selves, they think like a human self, like your introspective awareness of yourself. But he's using it in this broader sense to refer to basically anything that's alive.
Yeah, so he's got this conception that there's a unit of life, which he calls the self, and in plurally selves, and that it's the needs of these individual selves that give rise to our concept of purpose and norms.
And many of us here, I think, are influenced by our friend and colleague Harry Binswanger's book, Biological Basis of Teleological Concepts, which was based on his doctoral dissertation, where he tackles head-on the philosophical question I referenced previously of how you can make sense of non-conscious goals, non-conscious teleology. And I mean, he argues for a view that I think is complementary to what Sherman and Deacon are saying, that basically there's There's nothing mysterious about this broader non-conscious concept of goal. And you don't need to have consciousness of future states in order to explain how what looked like future states explain the past. And the way that he gives this, the example I always remember is, think about, why does the heart beat? There's a question put in terms of the goal of the heart. And the answer we typically give is the heart beats so that it can circulate blood. And the mystery then is, well, okay, the circulation is something that happens in the future. How can the future explain the past without some kind of magical causation? And Dr. Binswanger's answer is that, well, there's no mystery there if all you mean by that is that past instances of circulation explain the current beating, because they are what made it possible for the past instances of the heart to survive and to develop the kind of structure that they have, whereby they result in more circulation, which then enables the same circle to go on. And he says that's true both on a phylogenetic level and an ontogenetic level. So both the past existence of the same heart in the same organism, but also past hearts of the ancestors of the organism, said from the perspective of course, evolution. And Dr. Binswanger's view, of course, is informed by Ayn Rand's view. In her essay, The Objectivist Ethic, she has a very brief footnote about how she uses the term goal-directed to mean the fact that and here I'm quoting, the automatic functions of living organisms are actions whose nature is such that they result in the preservation of an organism's life. And so she's saying very explicitly, I don't mean that there's a conscious purpose operating with in non-conscious nature. It's just that the organism is such as to result in the perpetuation of its own life. And there's a lot packed into that, I think, that then needs explication. That's a lot of what Dr. Binswanger's view does. And I think there's a lot of similarities between what he's doing, what Sherman and Deacon are talking about.
I would like to point out, though, that there's a pretty running through the entire Sherman book, there's a kind of ambiguity between talking about those goals or aims as values of the organism versus talking about so that values become a feature of the world, if you like, that organisms are pursuing. Harry Binswanger deals with this issue by using the language of value significance when you're talking about organisms that can't actually frame a value in their consciousness that they're then going to pursue. And I think that's a better way to think about these non-conscious cases of goal-directedness than to talk about there being values, if you like, in the world that these organisms pursue. And I think that way of using language that's ordinarily appropriate, thought to be appropriate only for conscious pursuit of values, bleeds over into a lot of other cognitive language being applied to non-cognitive organisms, so interpretation and representation and so on.
So we have the philosophical problems concerning teleology, and now relatedly, there's the scientific question of how can goal-directed behavior emerge from parts or substance that outside of the context of a living organism is not goal-directed. And this is more the scientific question, the origin of life question. How could goal-directed things emerge from stuff that does not itself have goal-directed features? And to kind of arrive at his answer, I think the Deacon view makes use of some interesting philosophical innovation or philosophical innovations or different ways of framing philosophical questions, particularly with respect to what it is for something for a, a property or a feature to emerge from parts that doesn't have itself have that feature.
Actually, Mike, before we talk about the question of emergence, I think there's a question that comes even before that that's really important, which is emergence of what? And one of the things that I think Sherman and Deacon are really good on is getting clear about that. Because, and this is where I think philosophic insight is, it both shows itself in their work, but also where you see you need to have good philosophic insight in order to make scientific progress. Because if what we're talking about is how do we understand the origin of life, the emergence of life, you need to get clear on what life really is. And if life is essentially reproduction, which is what a lot of what you see in philosophy of biology, a lot of what you see in various understandings of evolution and various origins of life theory, well, then you explain the origin of life in effect by explaining the origin of that special kind of replication, and that's why a lot of origin of life theories focus on origin of DNA and RNA, and that's the way that Deacon and Sherman often um, identify their target. That they're opposing that idea, and the reason they oppose it is, well, basically, it's not just replication that makes something alive. There's all kinds of things in nature that replicate in one way or another, but which nobody would consider to be living, like catalytic processes, crystals, etc. And so these are all, they can, replicate indefinitely if they're in the right kinds of circumstances. But what's being replicated is not a living thing. And part of what Sherman and Deacon emphasizes is got to be the right kind of thing that's being replicated. And so you have to explain the origin of that thing before you can then talk about what allows for it to be reproduced and then to evolve. And in their view, it's self-protection and self-repair are the fundamental features of life.
Being
And
paired up as self-regeneration.
yeah, and then reproduction is reproduction of a self-repairing, self-protecting thing, and that's what then sets up a very different view about what the first living things are going to look like. And it's not trying to explain the origin of RNA and DNA. They think those things are not self-repairing and self-protecting in the relevant way. They're derivative from something that is. These things that Sherman and Deacon posit as being what they call autogens, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what those are.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one of the, I think, very important features of the approach they're taking is, and which I think is just fundamentally right, is that there has to be organisms of the kind they're talking about before you can get an evolutionary process going, so that it's figuring out what constitutes a living thing is a prior conceptual issue to the issue of uh, of how organisms evolved, how the evolutionary process takes place, and I think that's fundamentally right. It's a view you also find in Dennis Walsh's Organisms, Agency, and Evolution. That it's getting clear on what living things are is crucial to understanding how the evolutionary process could get going.
I think all of this also points out to, I just thought it was worth mentioning, part of the overall context setting that Sherman does at the beginning is noticing that in science and in biology in particular, there's a frequent use of aim. He calls them just aim related words like need, want, drive, or desire, and that there are two sorts of problems. One is that um, scientists sometimes apply them to organisms in ways that they should be applied, but then act as if it's just a metaphor or not a real application of it. And then the second kind of problem is that the application of that metaphor to things that don't actually have aims, like natural selection. And that part of what the book is doing too is clarifying that conceptual confusion by showing that actually it's not a metaphor. It's not there's not an equivocation. There really are aims, but then some of the ways that we use the term, for example, the idea of like natural selection programming, has to be clarified that that's neither uh, it's not a real aim that natural selection has, but it's driven by a process that involves actual aims. And I think that's an important context setting for what Sherman and I assume Deacon are trying to address.
Yeah, and just to give an example of where I think they're really good in showing how some conception of aim or goal is necessary for real biological explanation, even when we're talking about very non-conscious organisms. Let me read just a quick passage where I thought it was really well illustrated. Aimed work, and this is from chapter 8. Aimed work is energetic interaction that serves the self. Of all the work that could occur in Selves, the range of work is constrained, limited, or restricted such that it is of value or significance for the self with respect to or about its circumstances. A bacterium can distinguish between high and low concentrations of glucose and then aim for the higher concentration. The glucose provides energy for the bacterium to do work. Um, like any energy source, glucose can be used for a wide variety of work. For example, if you ignite glucose, it burns, producing heat that, assuming enough glucose, could warm a house. Of all the possible work that the glucose could do within the bacterium, those possibilities get channeled, limited, narrowed, constrained, or aimed into work that benefits the bacterium. Work isn't possible without energy, but glucose doesn't aim itself. The bacterium does the aiming. All selves have this capacity to channel or aim energy into work to achieve aims on their own behalf. We know a self's aim by the functionally constrained work it does. The aim is how the wider range of possible work is narrowed to work that benefits the self. So notice there you've got a very non-conscious organism, a bacterium, where it would be almost impossible to understand what it's doing and how it works without talking about various activities that it's engaging in as having a certain aim. And incidentally, by the way, this all makes sense to discuss, even if this were the only bacterium in the world that never reproduced. So, like, that's the fundamental of what it is to be a living thing.
Okay, so given this conception of what a living thing is, that is, it's a unit that self-repairs and self-protects, and their language is it's self-regeneration. That is, yeah, yeah. So these units self-repair and self-protect, and they kind of encapsulate this with the term they're self-regenerating units, or that's what a living self is. And then the question is, okay, well, how could a self-regenerating thing be made from um, parts that don't themselves have those features, especially given the tendency for physical processes uh, to fall apart or become diffuse. This is the point about the second law of thermodynamics, that everything tends towards disorder. So you have this kind of special system that is organized such that it preserves the organization. But the puzzle is, well, but doesn't in non-living systems, doesn't nature tend towards disorder and disorganization? So how do you get the order, the organization out of something that tends towards disorder? And in put if that's the question, I think my sense of this, and Jim, you'll have to give us the kind of broader biology context. Their solution, or Deacon's solution to the question, is a unique original solution, apart from whether or not it's the right one. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. At least I haven't come across anything like this idea of the coupling of distinctive kinds of autocatalytic processes in a specific way that first arises by chance interactions among these things, but sets up a situation where you can create a self-perpetuating kind of self-protecting and self-perpetuating kind of system. That to me is unique, and It's completely speculative as far as I can tell at this point, but
It's speculative, but it's clever, and it's
Well,
it's the
maybe
way.
you should make sure it's clear to
Yeah,
the.
that's what I was about to.
Okay, yeah, clarify what exactly the speculation is. Yeah.
It's interesting the way that the speculation is built right out of those prior points I mentioned about getting clear on the nature of life. So what's fundamental is self-protection and self-repair. And in effect, he says, well, look around in the physical chemical universe, and what are the processes that involve some kind of uh, replication, which are not yet themselves life? How could they come together in effect in order to create the first thing that's self-protecting and self-repairing? And so we have catalytic processes where one chemical basically creates another chemical, which then, and there are autocatalytic processes where the other chemical helps create the first. Normally, those will run out of steam after a while, but it's a kind of self-repair in that it's perpetuating itself. But then what happens if one of the catalytic outcomes is the creation of a self-protecting device, like certain lipid shells, which could contain some of the catalytic materials. I don't know the physics here. But those lipid shells then provide protection, but they can split apart, and then the whole process can go on and on. And that's what he calls this kind of autogenic system.
there's a
Yeah.
couple of times when they use uh, viruses as a kind of uh, analog model because, and it's been debated ever since viruses were discovered whether they're actually living things or not. Why? Because until they hijack the material, reproductive materials of other organisms, they're completely inert. They don't do anything, but they do have a protective shell that protects the uh, hijacking machinery, so to speak, so that when a virus happens to bump into something where it can hijack that material, it opens up and does so. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of, it's only an analogy. There's a lot of disanalogies, but it's a helpful model to think of when you're thinking about what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that they say it's like a thought experiment, but they also point out it's a thought experiment that in principle you could kind of find or test for. And Ben, you mentioned you looked into this. So the Sherman book is published in 2017, and he makes the claim that, well, we could look for this, we could try to experimentally create something like this. And what was it you found? They did computer simulations of this.
Computer simulations, but no actual laboratory tests so far.
Yeah, so it's in principle, you could take it out of the realm of the thought experiment into the realm of the laboratory experiment. But I thought one of the things that's interesting about this, one of the several things that's interesting about this is, um, in the way the thought experiment works, what you have is this reaction that has as one of the outcomes kind of something that contains and stops the reaction. And then by chance, this container like splits open and the whole process repeats itself. But that it's important that the self or the unit is not just like the shell, because when the shell is broken open, the reactions kind of diffuse and not in any one space. So you have to really take seriously that the unit is the matter under a dynamic process. It's not just a contained bubble, that it's the process is the unit, because during this opening phase, it's kind of like spread out, doesn't really have any clear boundaries. And I think that's why, like, that's my hypothesis is maybe that's why they want to talk about selves as a part, as opposed to organism, because an organism, at least to me, I kind of think of like, well, it's the body and it's got this skin boundary, but their point is more like, yeah, that's often how, or that's maybe mostly how it is, but it's really the process that thing is undergoing that's the self, not the body itself.
I think they make a bit too much of this. Like, I mean, and I don't know if calling it a self helps any, because when I think self, I think something rather more self-contained too. But it's true and important that when we talk about life as a self-generating process, process of self-sustaining, self-generated action is the way Ayn Rand characterizes it. That like the process is really central. And I think part of what she means when she says it's a self-generating process is that the process generates itself. It's not just that there's this thing, the self. Um, eh, there's just she's not saying there's this thing, the self, and it's this thing that generates the process. Part of what she also means is it's the process that's generating itself. It's a circular kind of process. But characteristic of her view of metaphysics, you can't have processes or actions without entities. And like, yeah, you do have to have an entity of some kind for there to be a living creature. Now, what it is to be an entity is itself that there's a whole array and range of things that I think you could legitimately consider entities. And it's true that the kind of autogens that Deacon and Sherman are talking about are like more diffuse, involving lots of entities that have an interaction with each other. But like by their own account, the autogen, as they describe it, is only a proto-life anyway. So like, it's not a surprise it would be only kind of a proto-entity.
Yeah. So another interesting philosophical dimension to this too is how Deacon thinks about emergence. So we talked about the you have to know what emerges, but then you have to also have some thinking about what an emergent process is. And as far as I know from reading a little bit on the philosophical and scientific literature on emergence, I think this is unique to Deacon's way of thinking, that ordinarily there's a kind of view that emergence is the addition of some or the spontaneous generation of some new kind of uh, element, property, process that can't be understood in terms of the parts. But Deacon's perspective is, instead of thinking about some new stuff coming into being, think of it as some kind of constraint placed on the constituent parts of the thing. So the ordinary course in an ordinary course of events, an organized system will tend towards disunity. So the parts will fall apart and the system will disintegrate. But what's going on in the life process is that there's a whole bunch of counteracting like barriers or blockers to this. And you can't think of that really as like some new stuff coming into being, but as various potential paths being redirected or stopped. So it's this kind of negative or constraining conception of emergence that I thought was interesting in its originality. I'm not convinced that that's right, the right way or a right way. And I think we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that because there's a real issue of Deacon seems to think that you have to take ontologically serious that there's an absence.
Yeah, I think there's something right to what he's talking about. It in the form of trying to dispel weird conceptions about what emergence would have to be. I think he puts too much stress on the fact that it's a subtraction. Too much stress in that he interprets it to mean what's really important is negation and absence. And yeah, well, but that negation and absence is caused by something. I mean, he uses the example of a whirlpool and as an example of a kind of order that emerges in nature, which I suppose is a correct way of talking about things. And he said, well, what causes a whirlpool is that there's some obstruction in a stream. And then because of that, there's only limited ways for the water to escape, and that creates the whirlpool. So that's an example of the kind of reduction in the possibility space and the absence of previous possibilities generating the whirlpool. But like you still had to put the obstruction there for those possibilities to be removed. So it's not like it's some kind of mere double negation. He talks about life as subtraction by a kind of double negation. You stop it it stops itself from going out of existence. And I mean, that's true, but I don't think that's the fundamental. Like, there is something it's actually doing to make that happen, something positive that it's doing, and it arises in the first place because some other obstruction creates some diminishment of possibilities.
Yeah, and there's a completely different way of talking about it that I think is more realistic, and that is to talk about all of the processes. I mean, if you think about the full range of organisms, all the millions of different kinds of processes that now exist on Earth that wouldn't have existed if life didn't come to be. So it's actually an expansion of the range of possible activities that take place on Earth because living things have arisen. So yeah, you can take the constraint language. It does a certain kind of work, but I think it also throws attention away from um, the massive expansion of activities and processes that take place on Earth because of the advent of life on Earth. I should also mention, I won't go into the details, but his account in the De Anima of the living capacity that's common to all organisms. In Aristotle's De Anima, sometimes translated on the soul, which isn't a great translation, but nevertheless, is very similar in form to what Deacon and Sherman are presenting, in that he argues that the basic capacities for self-maintenance um, uh, are the capacities that are passed on in generations, so that what's happening in generation is basically the recreation of the organism that's self-maintaining itself. So the account of processes of self-maintenance or self-regeneration and the processes of reproduction that Sherman talks about have exact parallels in Aristotle's discussion of the most basic capacities of living things. He actually says the capacity for self-maintenance and the capacity for reproduction are two functions of the same capacity.
Something that drew my attention to the Sherman book initially was his or their goal of giving a naturalistic but non-materialist um, answer to these questions. So I'm wondering if maybe it would help both our conversation and help the audience situate themselves. Like, what are the other views of both the origin of life, the evolutionary questions, and teleology that Sherman and Deacon are kind of in opposition to? So we've talked about, um, you might think Aristotle is reducing teleological causation to a series of material. What does that look like in a theory of biology? Do people hold something like that? I think we mentioned the RNA world earlier, where reproduction is centered. My understanding is that Deacon's approach is one of many in biology and philosophy of biology, which recenters the organism. Maybe you could give us a little lay of the land, Jim. That might help.
Yeah, a little. I mean, I think there's still I haven't taken a poll, but I would think there's still a lot of materialistic reductionists in philosophy of science and philosophy of biology in particular. But there are more and more people who are sort of at the center of the field that are taking organisms as the primary entity to be studied by the biological sciences. One of the reasons for that is developmental biology started to get reintegrated into biology in the 1980s and 90s. Evolutionary biology initially had thought they could sort of do without developmental biology because they had the idea that there was a one-to-one mapping between the traits of a fully developed organism and genes, so that you didn't have to know how those traits develop. All you need to know was there was a gene for those traits, and there'd be a one-to-one mapping between genes and traits, and we really didn't have to worry too much about the developmental processes that get you from the gene to the trait. Um,
So
that
is that like Dawkins idea of the evolution acts on genes and the genes the unit of
right, and the organism is just the gene's way of making more genes is his view. Um, uh, Dawkins, however, was never that popular among philosophers of biology, at least not the ones that I interacted with and talked to. That kind of genic reductionism um, has more popularity, I think, in the biological sciences than it does with philosophers of biology. But even in the biological sciences, I think it's now recognized that there's all kinds of epigenetic control over uh, the genome, and that the genome is um, uh, uh, no more in control of the developmental process than all kinds of other components of the cell and the organism, and even the organism's behavior, that actually control which genes are active when, which ones turn on when, which ones turn off when. And there's all kinds of self-repair processes, to get back to Sherman, um, involved. The genetic processes are fallible all over the place, but organisms have ways of um, repairing the damage that gets done to genes all the time to minimize the disruption in biological processes. Um, so anyway, Evo Devo comes along. That is the attempted integration of developmental biology and evolutionary biology. And then it's the organism that becomes the central focus, uh, the way in which the form of the organism controls what goes on within the organism and so on. That's been a major shift in the biological sciences, and it's had a major impact on the philosophy of biology as well. So a couple of books I had handy. One of the big names in philosophy of biology right now is Samir Okasha, and a recent book of his is Agents and Goals in Evolution. One that I've talked about a couple of times already, Dennis Walsh's Organisms, Agency, and Evolution. More and more, that's becoming the the focus of attention in philosophy of biology and biology now, which I think is really good, because it means um, something that's been happening in general philosophy of science, which is a shift in focus in the understanding of causation towards more entity, towards not trying to reduce explanation to some kind of logic, the way you had in logical empiricism and logical positivism, a shift to a real metaphysical discussion of the nature of causation, the role of understanding the capacities of entities in understanding why they behave and do and change the way they do. Um, that can be then translated into biology as, if organisms are the central subject of discussion, um, thinking about organisms as agents, playing causal roles in their lives. So you get, a real shift, I think, a positive shift away from a kind of Humean logical empiricist approach to these questions towards something that's much more focused on the metaphysics of causation, the nature of entities and agents in causal processes, and so on.
I am interested, Jim, about this extension of cognitive concepts to physical presence. I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier, but did you want to say any more?
Um, just that I think um, uh, it's so what I think is really positive in this theory that Deacon developed and Sherman is presenting in his book is what Ben already mentioned about the importance of getting a handle on what really life is, so that and and developing a concept of life, living things, selves as they call them, as agents um, uh, engaged in processes of, I would say, self maintenance. They say self regeneration, um, and self repair, and so on and so forth. Um, but I think it's important that there are a whole lot of different levels of living things.
Mhm.
And I worry about, in the same way that they might worry about metaphorical language about that's appropriate for living things being applied to non-living things. Sherman talks about that, and he's an opponent of doing so. I think it's similarly a mistake to take to use concepts that were developed quite specifically for higher cognitive processes and just applying them across the board.
Mhm.
And the two that I mentioned earlier are interpretation. Um, you find this a lot in the people that are generally in favor of reintroducing teleological explanation into biology, is that they will start using higher cognitive language to describe processes, um, because it's their only way of talking about teleological processes is to talk that way.
Double
But I don't think,
representation.
it's just seems inappropriate to say that a bacterium is interpreting, um, the fact that the glucose levels are higher there than there. Um,
Do you think does that mean there's a call for new concepts, or because you couldn't they make the case that, well, we just have to broaden these cognitive concepts in order to understand these living.
I think there are times. I mean, I don't think you can legislate. I think there are times when that might be the appropriate thing to do. In this case, I think we have language. Selective response, for example. I think that's what he's talking about. Dennis Walsh uses the language of that he borrows from J.J. Gibson's perceptual theory of affordances, that organisms respond to their world according to what affords them some kind of value. Um, and so I think there are other ways of talking about this that don't imply that the organism is um, uh, under, taking part of some kind of interpretive process. Um, and I think representation's the same. I don't even like representation when you're talking about perception, but talking about representation when you're talking about a single-celled organism moving around their environment, I think is just um, it's a misapplication of the concept.
Yeah, I had similar worries, though I'm a little less worried about it than you are, Jim, provided that they're clear about what they mean when they say something like interpretation or uh, representation. As long as they are clear to distinguish it from the conscious versions of those. And part of the reason I'm a little less worried is that, well, I think about the way that the same point um, with regard to teleological concepts, that we start with a concept of purpose for that we learn from cognitive conscious activities in human introspection, and we extend it. Now, is probably best extended with a new word like goal, which has got a
Yeah.
little bit less connotation of um, of consciousness. But like for some people, it does have the connotation of consciousness, and you then have to explain that even then. So there's a move here that you can make as long as you're clear about what you're doing. Though I do take your point that, yeah, if we've already got another term that is just as good, that represents the broadening from the cognitive concept, we might as well use it just for the sake of clarity. And another concept that I kind of changed my mind about in the course of reading this book, and also the Mitchell book that we're maybe going to still mention, where a lot of these ideas are used to discuss free will, is information. Where in the past, I had this same objection that you have to some of these other concepts like interpretation, because I took information as primarily a cognitive concept, and I thought it was misapplied to the non-conscious realm. And then I thought, well, okay, but why can't you just widen it to be inclusive of both conscious and non-conscious information? And then I thought, well, wait, in part because the discussion we had about the Mitchell book, actually, doesn't it work the other way around? Because information comes from something being informed, as in, passing on a pattern. And that's probably actually a materialistic kind of concept, or a more extrospective concept, at least, that then gets applied specifically to conscious processes, and maybe then takes on special, connotations because of that. But it actually starts um, in ancient philosophy, with a non-conscious kind of pattern transmission in mind. So there, it's even more innocent, I think. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a good. I don't know the history. I assume the word is initially Latin. It sounds like it probably started as a French version of a Latin word, and then the Normans brought it to English. um, but yeah, I don't know if it has that kind of history. The concept has that kind of history, that it originates as informing. Then that's that's a good point. And the history of the concept would be really interesting to me. They're relying on what uh, Shannon and Weaver did with the concept in early computer thinking in the 30s and 40s. But and there it's just information channels of uh, bits and bytes, so to speak.
Well, maybe we should turn to some of the kind of philosophical implications of the Deacon Sherman view. In particular, we wanted to talk about free will and then ethics. So why don't we start with free will? And I think I speak for the group on this one when I say we were all disappointed in the chapter on free will, in large part because what we expected was some kind of discussion of how the Deacon conception of agency um, uh, could give us what's the right word here? I was going to say genealogy, but maybe that's too confusing in this context. Give us a story about how primitive agency could kind of be developed into a conception of human agency, but that's not really what we got from the final chapter in it. Tristan, you point out that he even seems to think that uh, that primitive selves have a form of free will, and there's a question of whether his conception of free will is even indeterministic conception.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, to be fair to him, there's a lot left open. It's a really brief discussion, but he says, for example, Deacon's approach suggests that we should seek the roots of will in any self's aims, not in humans, where most of the free will debate is focused. And I think, as others have mentioned, or we've mentioned in previous conversations, he seems to really stress the importance of indeterminacy at the quantum level for this debate, which suggests that really what he's defending is a kind of indeterminism, that free will is consistent with a scientific picture of the world just because there is indeterminacy at a quantum level. But the obvious response to that, or the philosophical response to that at least, historically, which I think is a good one, is that random fluctuations of things don't make you in control. It doesn't answer the question of, are you actually in control of your actions? Are you actually responsible for your actions? And could you have done otherwise? So that question isn't really addressed. Um, and I think he makes interesting points. Uh, these are interesting discussions, but they don't seem to pertain to the actual philosophical problem of free will as it's typically framed. And so there's a lot that he just doesn't address.
Yeah, there's a quote here that I'll read that I he seems to even sometimes back away from claiming that there's a view of free will here. Here's a passage where whether we have anything like free will, is the way the sentence begins, as we imagine it, aims and the interpretations that follow from them clearly depart from strict cause and effect predictability. So it's the lack of strict cause and effect predictability that seems to he's saying here, give us the sense or feeling of free will. But as you say, it's basically because we're not in control, we have free will.
Well, and to one more point on that, Jim, to that point, he brings up this idea of strange loops. So a strange loop
Oh, yeah.
is, he describes it as an ambiguity of where you don't know what's driving the process. Um is something the cause or the effect, and you don't know the hierarchy of something. And then he describes selves as that, but that seems to suggest that we don't actually know whether we're in control or not. So, for example, we don't know if is it genes or something about our biological structure that drives our behavior, or is it the behavior that drives those, or the development of those, or the activity of those things. And so the whole chapter seems to suggest that at best, what we can get is a kind of science is consistent with free will, but we don't know whether, with the possibility of it, but we don't know whether it's true or not.
So there's bad news and there's good news, and the bad news is that this particular chapter in this book does not give us what we were hoping for. What I would have, hoped for is something that cashed in more on uh, the biological concepts that we talked about earlier in our discussion that form the bulk of the discussion in the book. The notion of understanding life as a kind of self-regenerating process, where there's a lot of focus on selves and how they are responsible for living processes, and not like their genetics or something like that. And the good news is that if you want to learn more about how that biological perspective does inform a concept of free will, look at the book that we talked about on the last bookshelf, which is Kevin Mitchell's Free Agents, where Mitchell himself seems to have read Sherman and or Deacon, has taken a lot from their thinking about the nature of life, and done exactly the thing we were hoping somebody would do with that. And he, as we discussed in that previous bookshelf, he does a very good job explaining how, as you go through the evolutionary tree, what you see is increasing levels of, in effect, self-regulation. More and more processes uh, come under the control of a living thing, to the point where you get to kind of the apex, which is human life, and where we have control not only over our nutrition and locomotion but also over our cognition, metacognition, and that's, I think, essentially what he describes free will as. And that's, again, a point that has a lot of continuity with, complementarity with something like Ayn Rand's view of free will, where free will is essentially your control over your cognition.
I should mention, I mentioned to you guys earlier, but I think mentioned it on the podcast, that I looked at Deacon himself on this topic, and I'll just read you a little bit of what he says, and it fits perfectly as sort of the foundation for what you just ascribed to Mitchell. Yeah, so the headline of this section is "The Locus of Agency." Perhaps the most enigmatic feature of self is its role as an agent, as the locus and initiator of non-spontaneous physical changes in the world around it. This is often confused with the age-old problem of explaining the possibility of free will in a deterministic world. However, it is different in a number of important respects. Self as agent is indeed what philosophers struggling with the so-called free will paradox should be focused on, rather than on the freedom from deterministic constraint. Determinate causality is in fact a necessary condition for the self to become the locus of physical work. An agent is a locus of work that is able to change things in ways more concordant with the internally generated ends and contrary to extrinsic tendencies. So that's what I was expecting when I got to the second last chapter of Sherman's book, but I didn't get it. So I went to look and see what Deacon himself had said, and it was much more what I was expecting than.
It's interesting that the geneticist and the biological anthropologist Deacon seems somewhat more philosophically insightful about free will than Sherman, who's more of a psychologist. I mean, I wonder if just there's such free will gets just such a bad rap in psychology that it's harder for Sherman to kind of break out of that.
Yeah, that's quite possible.
Possibility. Yeah. Okay, so the last topic we wanted to cover was Sherman's treatment of norms, ethics in the I think it is the final chapter of the book.
It is.
Yeah. And again, I think a lot of it's interesting. I was disappointed in the avenues Sherman didn't explore. So just to refresh ourselves, the kind of conception of where do norms and values come from that we get from Sherman and Deacon is this Rand-like grounding of them in the needs of individual living organisms. So that what it is for something to be good what it is for something to be good is relative to the agent taking the action that'll result in a good or bad outcome, and it's a good or bad outcome for the thing taking the action. So it's very individual centered conception of normativity and good and bad, etc. Now, to my mind, the next step to take in that is to say, well, that's some kind of individualist egoism by implication, but that's not the direction that Sherman goes. And I actually don't know if Deacon explores this himself, but almost immediately where Sherman goes to this is, well, it's selves that are the source of good and right action, and we humans sometimes sacrifice ourselves for other selves. And I said, oh no, such a disappointment.
I mean, I think I had all the same reactions as you did, Mike, and I think what possibly this is a reflection of is the some kind of ambiguity he himself has about what selves are, and it perhaps stems from the kind of exclusive focus on the process without the entity part. Because yeah, if you look at a one person helping another, and the focus is on the process and not the entity, well, yes, so there's a process whereby one person benefits the other self, and the self itself is just part of the process. It's not the entity. So I don't know if I'm making that perfectly clear, but it's like, here's something that I thought of when reading his account of evolution of selves more generally. Like, there's a very interesting story he tells about the best current thinking on the evolution of uh, the multicellular life, and in particular eukaryotes, where you have a mitochondria inside the cell, and that the mitochondria is now thought to be a uh, the relic of a bacterium that was captured by an archaic cell, and then they formed a symbiotic system. And now we think of it as a single. You can have a single cell that's a single organism that's formed out of what used to be two separate organisms, and then those reproduce, and you get multicellularity. And I mean, I think that's something right about that. It's got to be. And when you have a sufficient degree of symbiosis between perhaps what used to be two separate organisms, it's totally plausible to me that they come to form a greater organism, which now has interests of its own. And so there's like the way I often put it, like there's a kind of collectivist ethics that's true for various kinds of organisms when the symbiosis becomes sufficient, that there really is a greater organism. It's like beehives and ant colonies, etc. There's a way in which they do kind of form a kind of collective, and there are often ambiguity. Greg Salmieri has convinced me of the point. There's often kind of ambiguities where the organism leaves off, and the just a collection of organisms or a new bigger organism picks up. And so, like, if you are not very careful about what you think is individuating the organism, you could come to think that there's a way in which there's actually an organic kind of connection between one person and another. There's a greater whole. I mean, this is what, like, David Sloan Wilson tries to argue when he tries to uh, when he objects to Ayn Rand and individualism and says we should all be collectivists, because he thinks his multi-level selection theory of evolution generates a kind of collectivism. But yeah, so that's why it's important to get clear on free will, which we previously talked about, on why human free will is the kind of ultimate kind of individuating factor. And so even when an individual self benefits another, that doesn't rise to the level of the kind of symbiosis you would need to have now a new organism where there's a larger self whose interests are relevant. Human beings are very distinctive in this way. Yeah, we can help each other, but we also can go our separate ways, and often do, and often need to. And you can't really make sense of uh, what we're doing as even action for the sake of another, if you lose sight of the way in which it's action for the self, and then all the value concepts apply to that individuated action.
That's a really interesting connection, Ben. So where I thought you were going to go is you're going to say something about, like, there's the emphasis on the process puts an ambiguity as to where the process begins and ends, but really you can
That's related.
Yeah, well, I was going to say you can still maintain that perspective and just say, yeah, there's a maybe that's the source of the ambiguity for a beehive or whatever the example might be, but it's the fact of human free will that is, like, draws the non-physical dividing line between your process and my process and Jim's process and Tristan's processes, etc. That's a good connection that the two. I mean, we all found both chapters disappointing, and the disappointment stems from a kind of common.
Yeah, and here's a point to tie it up. So you can talk about one self benefiting another self, but it's not for the sake of the other self, unless you understand it by reference to the first self's actual benefits and interests and goals, which is the whole point of his theory is that for the sake of language, teleological language only makes sense in the context of the struggle for existence of the self, the actor, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you can talk about benefits, but that's not what it's for the sake of. But for the sake of, like, the ultimate goal of something, that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about right action and ultimately of ethics.
So I found that Ben, that's really interesting possible background. But I also think there's just in this chapter a fairly conventional view of what selfishness is and what altruism is, that altruism is actually a good thing. So I have to explain how it is that these selves, and here's a quotation that I think really reeks of that. We may claim that selfishness is universally bad. By the way, he uses we that way all the way through this book, and it kind of drives me a little nuts. But anyway, but at core, every self is inherently selfish, valuing what it values in order to best flourish. I would say, yeah, that's exactly what selfishness means. And from this selfish start can come altruism and a devotion to the common good that transcends the individual self. To me, what he's saying about the self being selfish is a description of moral goodness, but I think he just resists saying that.
Yeah.
Even though descriptively he thinks that is true about selves, he doesn't want to normatively endorse that as something that's morally good.
And it's too
So he
bad.
has to give an account of how this could lead to altruism. And
Yeah, it's too bad because at the beginning of that chapter, he talks about Hume, and he talks about Hume's
yeah,
rap, and he
yeah,
makes what I think is the right point about what Hume is really saying, and Hume is sometimes misinterpreted. That I mean, there's problems with Hume, but like one of the things Hume is really saying is that uh, yeah, you can't derive an ought from an is if what you mean by an ought is a kind of universal categorical imperative of the sort that religious folks are talking about. And Hume's right about that. And Sherman says that Hume is right about that. And he says it, and so from this, what we should take is like we got to rule out the search for like Platonic imperatives. But that doesn't mean that there's no objective basis for value concepts. And in fact, the whole theory that he's been arguing for provides that basis, and it's an objective basis. And you're cheering, and then you see the concession to the conventional thinking, which he probably doesn't realize himself comes from religion. The idea that if morality is anything, it's the rejection of self-interest. So it's just like, could you go one more step?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I had two thoughts about this chapter. I mostly agree with what you guys said. I think one other thing I would stress though is that even the conception of selfishness, obviously we can use it in that extended sense that organisms are self-interested in that they're guided by their own well-being or flourishing, but they're not self-interested in the human sense that they have a conception of their interests that they're pursuing, because obviously humans can genuinely choose not to do that. But then the other thing that I was disappointed in was the suggestion at times. So for example, halfway through the chapter he says, um he suggests that the autogen thought experiment is what you need to have an exploration of value in science. So he says, through the autogen, we discover that it may be possible for value to emerge from sterile dynamics. Fair enough. But then he continues, autogen theory makes the natural sciences safe for the exploration of value, real aims emergent within an otherwise aimless universe. And I think that was an unfortunate sort of ambiguity, because it's one thing to say, well, here's a theory that shows how value can come from a valueless universe. But that's different than making the claim that you need that theory to actually ground value in that universe. And that's where I think he's incorrect. Like the fact that value exists in living things doesn't depend on this being a good account of where the first selves came from.
Yeah, and I
Um,
think that
and I think that
connects
points
back
to
to
a
the
deeper
broader.
problem of how he's understanding value and how he's understanding self that you talked about earlier, Ben.
Yeah, it's I think that's an instance of the wider problem of his way of thinking about the role of his hypothesis in solving the so-called mystery of purpose. Is it there to validate the very concept of purpose, or is it there simply to explain how purpose might have arisen? And those are just two very different issues.
Very different.
It's one thing to show that um, in effect, it's one thing to show that purpose exists, and that it's naturalistically respectable. It's quite another to explain how purposes, goals, etc., came to arise. That's the scientific question. It's an interesting scientific question. He and Deacon have a very interesting hypothesis, which I hope they test. It might not be right, but if it isn't right, it doesn't eliminate the fact that value concepts and teleological concepts have some real basis. You don't eliminate a concept by simply failing to explain it.
I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, as it brings us back to where we started. So why don't we go around the clock and just give our kind of final evaluation of the book. Worth reading, positive or negative? Let's start with Tristan.
Yeah, I think it's worth reading. I have to say mixed. I think the the theory of how Ames came from a valueless universe, I think is really fascinating and really creative. And um, I'm interested to read Deacon, so I haven't actually read Deacon, so I can't compare it to that. But I think it's really insightful. But then on a lot of the implications or the putting the theory in the broader context, I have a somewhat more negative view.
I think it's worth reading mainly as to see a good example of how uh, philosophical clarity on a philosophical question is important for being able to ask and hopefully eventually answer scientific questions. I don't know what the answer to the scientific question here is, but I like the way they've gotten clear on key philosophic concepts, especially the concept of life, in order to set up the necessary scientific questions.
Yeah, I'd endorse what Ben just said, that I think there's a lot of value in this book in getting clear on how to distinguish organisms, living things from non-living things, and um, how that uh, can serve as the basis for understanding teleological processes in nature as something that arises naturally. I think, however, um, the most unique, I think a lot of that has been said elsewhere, and in some cases better. Um, but I think the really unique thing about uh, Deacon's ideas and Sherman's presentation is uh, the ideas about how living systems with purposes, goals, aims, seeking values, um, could have arisen in the first place. And that's a prior question to the questions about how organisms evolve, that, that evolutionary theory depends on that. I will say I haven't read all of Incomplete Nature, the Deacon book that Sherman is presenting to us. Um, if you can deal with it, it's much longer. Um, goes into the details in much more detail. But I have found on topic after topic that um, I found his presentation more um, enlightening than Sherman's presentation of Deacon's ideas. So, yeah, a semi-endorsement of Sherman, and a recommendation to, if you really find it interesting, go and look at Deacon firsthand.
Okay, so I agree with Ben, and I'll amplify some of what Jim said. And I thought the way of thinking about emergence was interesting and original enough that that's kind of, for me, that's what I like. That's my major takeaway. Like, I'm gonna think about this some more and look into how Deacon thinks about it in other contexts. So definitely worth reading. Um, whether one explores Deacon himself, I guess, will depend on how much one wants to know about the philosophy and theory of biology. So with that, we'll close this episode of our discussion of Jeremy Sherman's Neither Ghost Nor Machine on the ARI bookshelf. If you have any book suggestions for future podcasts, please send us an email or write it in the comment. We follow those recommendations on occasion. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share on YouTube, Facebook, X, and wherever else you might follow us. Ben, Tristan, Jim, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for the invitation. I enjoyed it.